Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about my thoughts about Season 3 of Star Trek Discovery. And I will not be going into the details of everything that happened, but I do want to talk about the things which I feel differently about after I see the full picture, the full season, compared to what I thought when I saw the specific episode. So I'm now looking at it all from the viewpoint of the entire season, and I do think it is kind of interesting that there were some parallels in specific episodes. It had the same kind of idea, and also the whole season idea was also similar to that, namely the whole idea of someone going through something very traumatic which leaves them broken, and then they're having to find out what happened and recover from it. And we had a few episodes with that kind of an idea, and the whole idea of the season is also kind of similar to that on a bigger scale, because it's all about how the Federation collapsed because of something catastrophic that happened, and now it needs to find out what exactly happened and then to rise from the ashes and to recover. And that's kind of the season long story. And we also had a few specific episodes with the same kind of story about individual characters. It first started with Adira, who couldn't remember what happened to her, and then she discovered that she had that tragedy of losing her loved one, and she was kind of afraid to find out what happened and didn't want to confront it. But after she confronted that, she was able to pick up the pieces and recover from that event and become an even stronger person. Then we had a similar story about that scientist on the seed ship who lost his entire family and was broken and became kind of like a ghost, and then he had to confront what happened, the fact that he cannot bring them back. He had to face that trauma and to overcome it to help other people. And then later in the season we had the story of Sukal, who also experienced a trauma in his childhood when he saw his whole family and his mother dying, and that trauma also is what led to the bigger catastrophe. And then he also has to confront what happened, he has to see what happened and to face it and accept it, and that way he can be free and move on. So we had the same kind of idea a few times across the season, and the bigger story is also the same way. The whole Federation became broken because of that catastrophe, and it traumatized everyone, and it changed some of the planets for the worst. Planets like Earth even became more of a xenophobic planet which doesn't want to be part of the Federation, and the rest of the Federation are not even trying to figure out what happened to cause that disaster, which didn't really make sense to me specifically, but we can kind of look at it as the same as those individual stories of psychology of people not wanting to face their fears or their traumas. So Starfleet and the Federation also apparently didn't want to face what happened, and they were too busy dealing with their current problems. But as it turned out, facing that trauma of the past was also what led them to the solution and recovering from their current problems as well. And so I kind of like the fact that this season had that kind of running storyline. And back then when the season started, I didn't like most of these things because it seemed to be just depressing. So constantly it's about people who lost their loved ones, constantly it's about broken people and the whole Federation being broken, and it all turned into dystopia and all of that. And so I didn't like it because it felt as if they're ruining the Star Trek universe, which was always an optimistic vision of the future, about an utopia, about people working together and exploring new things in the galaxy and all of that. And suddenly it's more like a Star Wars universe in which everyone are fighting each other, and it's a battle for survival and all of that, and it's much darker, much more depressing, and even these individual stories which were always about bad things happening to people. And so I didn't like these things at first because it felt to me like they're ruining the very vision of Star Trek, of the enlightened bright future, of the utopia and optimism and all of that, and instead it's now all depressing and it's all sad and hopeless and it's a Wild West galaxy. But because in the end of the season they're kind of fixing that, so now we see that the Federation are coming back and it's all becoming an optimistic, uplifting vision once again, then I can kind of forgive that. The only problem I had with that is that it kind of came out of nowhere. It was too rushed. So one moment it's all a dystopian galaxy, the next moment suddenly all the problems are fixed and suddenly it's back to how it's supposed to be. So that's kind of the only problem I had with it, is that it was too rushed and too easy, and it was all done kind of by luck. It all happened, at least in part, by sheer luck. It's like winning the lottery. So they just happened to find that planet full of dilithium, and that solves the whole problems of the galaxy right away. So that's kind of a too easy solution. Wouldn't it be more clever if they simply replicated the Discovery's technology and simply started using spore jumps to get around the galaxy instead of the lithium? Wouldn't that be more clever? And yet no one seems to even consider that possibility of Discovery itself being so important. And so, in the end, Discovery's uniqueness was pointless to the story. Even though that also would have been a too easy solution, but at least it would make sense in the context of the show. And yet, it was kind of stupid how no one even considered that as a potential solution. Like, Starfleet didn't even seem happy to find the Discovery and to find out about the spore jump. Like, it was just, oh, by the way, they have an instantaneous method of traveling around the galaxy, so we're going to use them for missions and all of that. No one seemed to be happy about this whole concept, and so that kind of annoys me still. In the end, the solution was simply finding more of the same stuff that was before, and so I thought they're kind of using all of this to move to something else, to invent some other method of transportation, and maybe that would even be a good idea to kind of reboot the Star Trek universe, because of all those variety of different FTL methods, and all of that was kind of too messy, like too much technology. So maybe they could have said that all of those methods depended on dilithium, and that's why all of them are not working anymore, and that's why they have to use something new from now on, even though I think the spore drive itself is kind of overpowered. If anyone can get around the galaxy instantly, it would be more like a Stargate type of show, not really Star Trek. But maybe they could then do another show later about going to other galaxies, and maybe the spore drive doesn't work in other galaxies, and so only in the Milky Way galaxy you will have instantaneous travel, and in other galaxies you wouldn't. You would have to use some other methods of getting to those other galaxies, and so they could do so much more stuff to kind of reboot the whole Star Trek idea and do something fresh, but instead it's just going back exactly to how it was before, and so I'm not sure it was the best choice after, destroying the whole Federation and wiping out all space travel and just going back to how it was. It's just, so what was the point of doing all of this if not to reinvigorate and reimagine the whole Star Trek universe into something new and better, and instead it's just going back to the same things. Also, I think this season's villains were kind of weak and pathetic and not really interesting, and they were just a bunch of criminals basically running the galaxy, and that's it, and we didn't really get to explore that at all. So they were just the bad guys, just one-dimensional bad guys who just have to be killed, and that's it. And that's another problem I have with the ending, because, in the spirit of the older Star Trek shows, in the good episodes at least, that's not how they solved problems. They usually solved problems with their mind, not just by violence, not just by killing the bad guy. Often it was something more complex and interesting. Sometimes it was by diplomacy, by politics. Other times it was by subterfuge, planning some kind of trap for the villains, doing something clever, defeating them with their brain, because the villains were often much more powerful physically. Either they had more ships or more powerful ships or better weapons, but the heroes defeated them anyway by using something clever. And yet, in the end of this season, they basically defeated the bad guys by violence, by force, by just killing them all, and that's how they won in the end. And so I thought that's not interesting, it's disappointing. It could have been and should have been more complex and more clever, and maybe even morality-wise to have a better message, maybe solve the problems some other way, not by violence. The only time it kind of piqued my interest was when Osira suddenly revealed that she actually wants peace with the Federation, that she actually wants an alliance, and that's the only time when she wasn't a one-dimensional villain. But then they totally gave up on it and just came back to violence and just had to kill her in the end, and that's it. So what was even the point of all of that setup? So I think it could have been much more interesting if they did come to some kind of negotiated, diplomatic, political solution with their enemies, or maybe having both of them facing some bigger enemy or something like that would have been much more interesting, instead of just killing the bad guys and that's how you win and that's it. And even character-wise, I thought it wasn't interesting. We have Michael Burnham, and I talked about her a lot. I'm not going to repeat all my points about that character, but I think early on in this season they actually did a good job trying to reimagine this character. They gave her a time jump. They said that she spent a whole year alone, being away from Discovery, and so she kind of changed a little bit. She became more human. She grew longer hair, so even physically she looked different, and so she kind of became a slightly different and better character at first. But then toward the end she became just the same old Michael Burnham who just solves all the problems with violence, and she's just the strongest and bestest at everything, and that's how she wins, and that's how she solves all the problems, just by killing all the bad guys, and that's it. So I thought in the beginning of the season they were improving her character. They seemed to be self-aware of the problems with this character and why people disliked her, and seemed to be trying to fix it. So suddenly she's more likable, suddenly she's more charismatic, she's less annoying. and the show seemed to be doing more teamwork instead of just one character doing it all. And yet in the end of the season, it's once again this one character doing it all and solving all the problems by herself, while the rest of the crew are totally useless. So the bad guys take over the ship, and most of the crew are not able to do almost anything, and she single-handedly saves the whole ship and the whole Federation from the bad guys. And she did it just by killing the bad guys. And one of the things that annoyed me more than anything about it is that she only won because the villains were stupid, because there were a lot of moments in which she was captured, in which the villains could have simply killed her or put her in restraints, but instead they put her in easily escapable situations which she exploited, and that's how she won in the end. And that really pisses me off, because that is bad writing. And especially because she was praised for all of it in the end, but she only won by sheer luck. Just because the villains happened to be stupid, and she happened to exploit that, and that's how she won in the end. And then the Admiral is apologizing to her in the end and saying, you were right, you had your own way to do things, and your way was equally successful and whatever. And that really annoyed me, because based on what we saw in the show, she only won by sheer luck because the villains were so stupid, and she was just extremely lucky, and that's why she won. So she didn't really win because of her cleverness or because she did something so creative and so amazing that no one else could think about. No, she just won because she's super powerful, she has a super thick plot armor, and even though she was in situations in which the villains basically captured her, and yet they didn't kill her for some reason, and that's how she won in the end. So she wasn't really a clever character in those situations, she was just extremely powerful and extremely lucky because of the way it's written. And so I wouldn't say she was a good leader or a good hero even, and even morality wise she just killed everyone in the end, even when she didn't have to, because after she killed Osira, she also decided to blow up her entire ship, which was seemed to be very big, so it must have contained thousands of people. Maybe many of them were civilians or scientists or women and children, and yet that didn't cross anyone's mind about possibly why not try to take over that ship, or to let them know that Osira is dead and that they're free, because aren't they basically slaves of Osira? So maybe we should have had a scene of the people of Osira being happy that she died and then being free of her and all of that. But instead Michael decides, no, we have to blow up her huge ship as well, even though she's dead. And she's willing to risk her own ship to do it, and that really annoyed me, because they didn't know if they can spore jump out of there. It all depended on the theory that Book can also pilot the spore drive, which they didn't even test first, and she immediately wants to eject the warp core to set it to explode, and then try to spore jump out of there. So that, I think, was a huge risk. She could have lost the Discovery, and then without Discovery then they wouldn't be able to get the dilithium and send it to the whole galaxy, so she would doom not just Discovery but maybe the whole Federation. And yet she was willing to do it just because she wanted to blow up that huge ship for no reason. They didn't have a reason to do it. They could have just escaped, or at least try to escape first, and then if you really want to destroy that ship then you can go back and then do it again. But no, she risked her whole ship because she so badly wanted to blow up the ship of the bad guys by setting the warp core to explode. And why not use photon torpedoes? You were inside that ship. You could have simply started shooting from it from inside, or at least give them an ultimatum, tell them that you're about to blow yourself up so that they will release you. But no one even tries to do it. No one tries to negotiate with whoever was in charge after Osira was dead. So why not? In the history of Star Trek, and even in other TV shows and movies, the hero only kills the bad guys if he has to. He always tries to get a peaceful solution first. And yet in this show, very often they're not even trying to. I guess she tried with Osira, but why not try to the second in command of Osira after she is dead? Why not try to negotiate with whoever is in charge of the ship to let them go? They're not even trying to do it. So they just decide to blow them all up, kill thousands of people, and also risk their own ship to do it. And so I don't think she's a good leader in that situation, because she risked her ship for nothing, and she killed all the bad guys without even trying to negotiate with them, and probably killed countless of civilians. And I thought about doing a compilation video of just counting how many people she killed in this whole season, and it's probably a lot of people. And so she wins in the end simply by being reckless, by being impulsive, by being super lucky, and by being very bloodthirsty and just killing all the bad guys without remorse, without even trying to negotiate with them. And so that's how she wins in the end, and then the Admiral praises her for that and makes her a captain. So I think that was a mistake by the show. I would have no problem with her doing all of those things, but don't praise her for it, because there were so many points in which she only won by pure luck. I don't think being super powerful automatically qualifies you for being a good leader, and risking her whole ship and crew just because she wanted to take out that big ship was not a good decision. And it actually reminds me of all kinds of situations in the old Star Trek shows who did those kind of things and got their whole crews killed for no good reason, and they were said to be bad captains. And especially comes to mind the episode Valiant from Deep Space Nine, which showed us a ship run by cadets, and they were kind of arrogant and they were so sure of themselves, and especially the captain, and he was willing to risk his whole ship on some kind of a dangerous mission to try to destroy a much bigger ship of the enemy. And in the end, because of his arrogance, they failed the mission, and the whole crew got killed except a few survivors. And then one of those survivors said he only failed because we failed him. And then Noak told her, no, in the end, maybe he was a great man, maybe he was a great officer even, but in the end he was a very bad captain because he got his whole crew killed because he took an unnecessary risk. And even Jake earlier in that episode said that his father would not have done that because in the situation of that episode they had a way to simply escape, and yet instead they chose to risk everything to try to take out that huge ship because they were so arrogant they could do it, and then it cost the whole crew their lives. And so the message of the episode was that arrogance and overconfidence are not good qualities in leaders, that a leader should be more careful because he has the responsibility to protect his crew. And even in wartime, maybe sometimes it is necessary to sacrifice your whole ship to win and all of that, but it wasn't the situation in that specific episode, and it just got all of them killed. So it was a stupid decision. So that captain was reckless and overconfident, and he was a bad captain in the end, and that was the whole message of that episode. And there were other episodes of Star Trek also showing bad captains who do reckless things. And so here we have Michael Burnham, and from what we see in the episode, she's been very reckless, she's been very unwise in her decisions, and she only wins because the universe seems to revolve around her, and that's why she always wins. And even earlier in the season, even when she failed to do something, it also led to a good solution. So even when she fails, she still succeeds, and so that also was very annoying. Like when she tried to get something from the Vulcans, and she had to kind of stand trial in front of them, and then she failed that trial, but because of that she somehow still got the information she wanted. So it's as if even when she fails, she still succeeds, and so it's always very annoying because she's just so lucky. And so in the end she wins purely by luck, because all her crazy plans somehow works, and because the villains are too stupid, and that's why she wins in the end, and not by real cleverness. And that's why it is kind of annoying to me, especially when the Admiral praises her for that. Doesn't he know exactly what happened? Didn't he read the full reports of what happened? So shouldn't he know that she only won by pure chance, by pure luck, and that she could have easily got all of them killed? And so why the hell is that a good thing? And so why is she getting promoted to captain simply because she's so lucky and she's so good at killing? And it almost makes it the same as in the mirror universe. You know how in the mirror universe people get promoted, the more ruthless they are, the more bloodthirsty they are, the more people you can kill in the mirror universe, the higher the chance you will get promoted. So why is it working the same way in the normal universe? Why is Starfleet promoting her? Simply because she's so good at killing people, killing the bad guys. She killed more of them than anyone else, and therefore she's the bestest, and therefore she gets promoted, and not because she's clever or wise, or because she did something super clever. And so that's why I don't like that ending. And also the way they sidelined Saru, who actually became a good character. Like, I hated Saru when the show started, but then the actor was so great, and they actually gave him good lines, and they gave him clever dialogue, and they gave him good development. So he actually became a good character. And also I thought it's such a nice thing to finally have an alien captain of a Starfleet ship, because, you know, in all the other shows the captain was always a human, and I thought if Starfleet is supposed to be made up of many different aliens working together, then how come only humans get to be the captains in the shows? And so I thought it's a good idea to finally have an alien as the captain, but then they robbed it away from him because they wanted to promote Michael. And it's also annoying retrospectively looking early on in the season how she generously gave him the option of being captain, because even though she could have been one herself, but she gave it to him, but then he screwed up allegedly according to the show, and then she gets promoted because she's the bestest ever, and it's reluctantly. She doesn't really want to be the captain. She wanted to give it to Saru, but then Saru chose to go back to his home planet, and that's how she becomes the captain. And he was actually good at diplomacy and all the things I said the captain should have. Saru was actually good at those things as well, so he was much more you know, like a Picard type of captain, who's actually using his mind and using his brains and using diplomacy and politics and all of that. But instead they gave it to Michael, who's just the best at killing people, and I don't think it's the best solution. Maybe actually in some way it would be good for the next season, because if there will be a season 4, At least Michael will be stuck on the bridge most of the time, hopefully, and will not be going on every single away mission, and it will finally allow some of the other characters of the show to develop and to do things by themselves without Michael constantly being the hero of every situation. And so maybe in that sense it would be a good idea to have Michael stay on the bridge for some of the time and not be involved in every single operation and every single mission. So maybe in that sense that would be a good idea. And also it's funny that despite her being so insubordinate or early on in the season, she constantly didn't want to take orders. She's the one who decides to do everything and she doesn't want to listen to anyone. And so she should have been taught a lesson, and instead she gets promoted for it. Instead they just, it's as if they decided, okay, we cannot control you, Michael, you're too powerful for anyone to control, you don't want to listen to anyone, so let's just put you in charge. So now you're in charge and you do whatever you want now. And this way we'll have no problems. And so that's not the way it works in the chain of command, and she didn't really learn her lesson. Like, if at least they taught her a lesson first, she needs to follow the chain of command even if she disagrees with the commands, but she never learned her lesson. Instead, everyone are apologizing to her, everyone telling her, no, you were right all along and we were wrong. And so she doesn't really learn any kind of lesson, and she's just becomes even more arrogant in a way. And so that's why I thought it's not a good story arc for her, and it's too bad because the season actually started out good in that sense, because they seemed to be fixing the problems with this character, but in the end she became the same exact character she was before, always disobeying orders, always doing it her way, and winning by sheer luck, by plot armor, by coincidences, because the villains are stupid, because, you know, everyone loves her, even the villains love her. When Osira meets Michael, she says, oh, I like you, and so even the villains love her. And so it's that Mary Sue problem of the show, of the main hero being like a fan fiction character that everyone loves, who's the best at absolutely everything, and the rest of the crew being useless. And so that's something I don't like in this show, and especially in the end of this season. It was kind of ridiculous, and it's a missed opportunity because it could have been good, and I would be fine with her being a very powerful character, because, you know, that is part of the setup, that she's so smart and so well trained and all of that. So fine that you can let her do a lot of this stuff, but at least leave a bone, leave something for the rest of the crew. And they did do it a little bit, you know, Saru did something on that planet, and the rest of the crew contributed something. They slowed the ship down, you know, when Mrs. T sabotaged the nacelle to slow the ship down, but in the end that was pointless. It didn't really help the situation. So fine, they dropped out of warp to allow Starfleet to catch up to them, but in the end the rest of Starfleet doesn't do anything. So that also was disappointing. There was no big space battle with the rest of Starfleet, and for some reason, even though they dropped out of warp in the end, the rest of Starfleet doesn't catch up to them. Instead, the big ship of the bad guys swallows them up, and so that's all they achieved. So the rest of the crew sabotaged the nacelle that slowed the ship down, and then the ship of the bad guys swallowed them up. And so what exactly is so good about it? So if they didn't do it, Michael would have killed all the bad guys on the ship, and then they could have escaped without all of that. And so it was pointless in the end. The only actions that had any meaning was those of Michael Burnham. And I guess maybe the only thing that was good out of the fact that they got swallowed up by the big ship was that it allowed them to destroy the big ship, but that wasn't really that important because Osira was dead at that point. They found the dilithium planet, they could take all the dilithium, and then the Federation will rise more than anyone else. So why did it matter that they had to blow up the big ship? So they only did it for the visual. They just wanted to have that image, that special effect of the huge big ship of the bad guys blowing up, and so that's why they did it, but it wasn't really necessary. It didn't serve any purpose for the bigger story. It was just for the visual special effect. And that's one of my problems with the show, that a lot of time it's style over substance. They just want to have those special effects or action scenes. The plot is only a way to connect the dots and to contain all of it, but the special effect comes first. The first priority is to have the big explosion in the end, and the story is written to accommodate that instead of it being the other way around. In a good movie or a show, the story has to come first. There has to be a good, interesting story, one that will be interesting even if you just read it without seeing the special effects. If you just read it on a piece of paper and you'll find it interesting, then that's a good story. If it's good even without the special effects. But in the show, it's the other way around. And so they should have first written a good story and only then have the special effects and action scenes on top of it to enhance it and to improve it. That will be totally fine. I'm not against having action scenes and special effects, but it should only come in service of the story, and they're doing it the other way around. They first want the action scenes and the explosions and the cool scenes and all of that, and the story is written only as a way to connect the dots and to allow for all those action scenes. And that's why the story suffers. That's why the story is not so good in the end and often makes no sense, because I analyzed this in my specific reviews, but a lot of times when you look at the actual details, it doesn't make any sense, because, you know, they wanted to have the scene of Michael sucking the bad guys out into space, and she sets up that elaborate trap, but why not just use the phaser to just shoot them? You had the phaser, you had the bad guy catching your feet, and you could have just shot her with your phaser, but instead you set up that whole plan of the hatch opening into space to suck her out. So why not just shoot her? So why? Because they wanted to have the scene of someone getting sucked out into space, even though it made no sense. And even the villains don't make any sense, because they were trying to capture Michael when they could have simply shot her. So why was that other alien woman trying to catch her leg when she had the weapons, presumably? So why not just shoot Michael? And if you don't want to kill her, you can just stun her with a phaser. So no one seems to be aware of those options, and instead she tries to grab her physically by the leg, and then she gets sucked out into space. And that's only because the show wanted to have that cool action scene of someone getting sucked into space, like in Aliens, and also having that Die Hard kind of story, and Michael goes around beating people up instead of just using the Vulcan nerve pinch or just phasering them. She just beats them up all the time because they want to have the action scenes. And so that's what I mean when things don't make sense in the context of the show and things don't fit together. And it's all because of the style over substance, because they wanted to have the action scenes and special effects, and so they invested in that and not in the story or dialogue or the cleverness of it, and instead it's just an action schlock and all of that, which has its own charm. I'm not against action scenes, as I said, but it should have been done more logically and more cleverly and appropriately. And also I would have liked it if in the end they solved the problems with their brains and not just by killing all the bad guys one by one, and that's how they win. So that was kind of lame in my opinion, and in the end she's praised for it. So Michael, you killed the most people from anyone, so that's why we're making you the captain. So but as the captain she won't be able to do that. Shouldn't she be like the tactical officer? If she's so good at killing people, then they should make her the security chief and send her on all the most dangerous missions. So putting her as the captain is not the most clever choice. The captain should have been the best diplomacy, the best one at leadership, the best one who is able to organize everyone, and the chief of security should be the one most powerful physically, you know, just like it was in TNG when Worf was the one who was the best at beating people up. And that's also one of the problems in this show, that it doesn't seem to be about a team effort. It's more like a superhero show with one character who is the best at everything with a bunch of sidekicks. But the Star Trek show was always about a team effort, about a whole team of people, and everyone are being good at a specific task, and when they work together, that's when they can accomplish great things together. But in this show it's only about one character who is the best at everything, and the other ones being sidekicks. And I was hoping they will change that in this season, but in the end they reverted right back to this formula, which is not good. But maybe in the next season, maybe since now she's the captain, she'll be stuck on the ship most of the time, hopefully, and other people will get to shine and get to go on missions instead of her. But probably it's not going to happen. Probably she's going to go on all the missions by herself and doing it all by herself while being captain at the same time, which is not a good idea. But I guess we'll wait and see. So that's my thoughts on some of the problems in this season. And it actually started out good, and they had a lot of location shootings, and so visually it was much better than before. It wasn't as claustrophobic as before because they finally go to planets. But I suspect maybe they blew most of their budget early on, and so in the end maybe that's why it was kind of disappointing. They didn't even have a huge fleet battle in the end, which might have been ridiculous, but at least it would have been entertaining visually. And they seemed to be setting it up, but then didn't do anything with it. So there were a lot of cop-outs in the end. Like they set up Michael's mom as a space ninja, so I expected her to show up in the end after she called her, and yet she never showed up. So what was even the point of setting her up as a space ninja when you don't even show her in action in the end? And so stuff like that, which they seem to be setting up and then didn't deliver in the end. So I suspect maybe they simply ran out of budget toward the end of the season, and that's why it became more like a bottle show of just Michael killing people in the corridors and not any kind of big action scenes out in space. And so I thought the end of the season was kind of disappointing and not very original, and it felt like a cross between Die Hard and Total Recall and even James Bond, because you know how in James Bond a lot of the times the villains are kind of overconfident, and they just leave the hero in an easily escapable situation where he escapes and then he kills the bad guys. And so we have something similar here as well, because at some points the villains physically captured Michael. They could have simply put her in handcuffs, put her behind the force field, but instead they allow her to escape because of their stupidity, and they don't kill her. They try to grab her by the feet instead of just phasering her, and that's how she wins. That's when she kills all of them. And that formula kind of worked in James Bond because it was kind of comedic. It was kind of not taking itself too seriously in a lot of those older movies, which were kind of silly in a good way because it's almost like a comedy. And so, a lot of parodies were made of that. Even in Deep Space Nine, there was an episode making fun of that. And always that formula of the bad guy, Dr. Evil in Austin Powers was based on all of those things from the Bond movies, which were silly. And so that's kind of funny when you look at it. But in a show like Star Trek, you expect something more clever. You expect the hero to win with his mind and not just because exploiting the weaknesses and stupidity of the villains. And so that's one of my problems in the end of this season. It wasn't clever, it was disappointing and even stupid when you look at the details. And I'm not saying the older shows didn't have those kinds of episodes as well. Of course they did, of course. But those were not the episodes that people remember. People remember the clever episodes. The one that had some kind of interesting, complex science fiction idea, or a morality tale, or an ethical dilemma, or some kind of hard choice by a character, or some kind of clever twist which you didn't expect, or a team effort. All those more complicated, complex things to solve a problem, and not just going around killing all the bad guys and then winning. So that's why ultimately I thought this season was disappointing. Even though it did have some redeeming elements, and I did like specific scenes and specific episodes, especially the one with Adira early on, which was actually done well, and I felt emotions in that episode, maybe for the first time in this show. And I really like that character. The actress is great, and I really loved the setup of it, and I thought she's going to be a great character because they set her up as a thrill with multiple lifetimes of experiences, and so I thought she's going to rise up and become a great character, but then in the end they didn't really do anything with her, and so she remained the same kind of scared little girl as she started, despite the fact that she regained all the thrill memories. So I thought she's going to grow up to be an awesome character, at least like Jadzia in Deep Space Nine was an awesome character. But in the end she remains the same as she was before she discovers all the thrill memories, and so what was the point of that? And she just stayed the same way, and so I thought that also was a huge missed opportunity because she had so much potential as a character, and then they didn't really do anything. But maybe in the next season they will, because she stayed on the ship, and maybe it won't all happen right away. And maybe in some ways it's a good thing not to rush things. Like, I wouldn't have liked it if just in one episode she's suddenly the bestest at everything, and suddenly she will become the admiral. She would overthrow that other admiral and become the admiral by herself right away. That also would have been ridiculous. But they should have found a middle ground, like show some bits of awesomeness and character growth and becoming more confident and all of that. That should have happened in this season, and yet it didn't. She became just as scared little girl as she started out, even worse than she started. And so what was the point of becoming a thrill, regaining all the thrill memories, and then just staying the same shy little girl who is hiding away in the ship? And I think maybe that's one of the biggest missed opportunities in this season. Another thing that was disappointing in this season in terms of science fiction, it didn't really show us any new ideas. It was all the same exact stuff as before, despite the fact that they jumped so far in the future, so you would expect to see a lot more fantastical technology, and yet, with the exception of a few visual things like the detached nacelles and the floating tables and stuff like that, there was not really anything new at all. There were no real advancements in technology apparently, and it's kind of the opposite problem I had with the show early on, when I said that since they set it up before TOS, and yet at the same time had technology which seemed more advanced than in all the other shows, and so that annoyed me in the previous seasons when they tried to be a prequel and yet didn't pay attention to any of the details of the lore of that universe, of that timeline. And so they jumped to the future, I think partly because of that criticism, because they wanted the fans to stop complaining about why the technology is too advanced, and so they jumped to the far future way after all the other shows. And yet again they didn't pay attention to the details, because sometimes in all the other shows we saw people from the future which had much more advanced technology, which seemed much more magical to the characters. And so now they jump the whole show into the future so that they wouldn't be limited. They can now do whatever they want, and yet they don't really do anything amazing. So now technology seems to be roughly the same as in the 21st century, because, even the mobile transporter badge, we saw that in Nemesis. We saw Data giving that kind of badge to Picard, who then beamed himself out without using the ship itself. And so it's the same level of technology as we saw back in the older Star Trek shows, and so this is centuries in the future, and we don't really see any progress in technology, and even the ones we do see don't really make any sense. Like the detached nacelles, which actually defended, and I liked that idea, and I made videos about that, saying how it could work and how it can be used in all kinds of new ways, and yet they didn't really do any of that. And they said specifically it's being held together by magnets, and a small explosion in one place of the ship can disrupt that, and you can go out of warp because of that, and so that made it look stupid. And so even the small ideas that I actually liked were disappointing in the end, and things like the holograms being less advanced than they were before, that they can be disrupted by simply blinking at them, and that they always have those glitches and all of that, so they seem less advanced than how we saw even in the older Star Trek shows, and we don't see any sentient holograms or AI, and everyone seemed to be surprised by the Discovery's computer, which is more sentient than others, but in this time period you would think that sentient AIs would be everywhere, and yet they are not, and there's no internal explanation. And I said before, if they simply explain it somehow, I would be okay with that. If they say that certain technologies got banned because they're too dangerous or whatever, then I'll be fine with it. And yet, at no point no one said that, except for time traveling, which they said was banned because of the temporal wars, which actually I liked. I liked that idea. Maybe I'll talk about it separately later. But why is the rest of the technology suddenly less advanced than it should be? Now, they did have the excuse of the burn, so maybe you can say maybe because they have less dilithium, and dilithium is the main power generation method, and so without it maybe they don't have as much power for all the more advanced technologies, so maybe you can make that the excuse for it. But still, I feel like this show didn't have enough imagination to have all kinds of brand new things which should exist in this time period and yet don't. So that was disappointing, and also that's something they could have talked about and explained in the show, and then I will be fine with. And also I'll do a whole video just on this topic of how can technology become stagnated. Maybe the more you go to the future, it becomes harder and harder to come up with new technologies. That actually would make sense, especially if they limit AI and stuff like that, and only rely on human scientists, and maybe humans get to a certain point of science and technology beyond which it's harder and harder to progress and invent new things. I actually would be fine with that. I'll do a whole video just on this topic, but the show itself never explored any of this. It never really discussed any of this, and it just feels lazy that they didn't come up with anything new in terms of technology or science, and I didn't really encounter any new science fiction ideas, and in a lot of places it feels much more like fantasy, especially with the whole plotline of Sukal causing the burn by screaming so loudly that it went to whole the galaxy. So all of that was kind of ridiculous, and the story itself I thought was fine if it was its own limited story affecting a limited amount of space, and yet it affected the whole galaxy. And we know in the other shows there were so many much more advanced beings in the galaxy who should have been so powerful it wouldn't have affected them anyway, and they could have fixed the problem by themselves, and yet no one else in the whole galaxy fixed it except for Michael Burnham, who is the bestest ever at everything, and that's why only she can fix the whole problems of the whole galaxy, which existed for a whole century. No one else discovered what she discovered in 1 year. That is kind of silly and lazy writing, and it ties with the same problems I mentioned previously. So anyway, that's all I had to say about it for today. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss it in the comment section below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.